everybody. It's time for us to get started. We are in Joshua chapter 3, and we're beginning a new section in the book. The book is split into two large sections, where you've got the conquest of the land, followed by a portion of the inheritance. We're still in we're really at the beginning of the conquest section. In fact, the conquest itself has yet to begin. But the text that we're going to start today sets us up for the conquest. Chapters 3 through 5 cover Israel's crossing from the plains of Moab into Canaan proper. And before we get into the text, I want us to see that this is going to be, this part of the story is really elaborately put together. And that's done to really emphasize what's going on in this story. Right? Obviously, everything that happens in Scripture is important. Sometimes the Scriptures will draw our attention to specific things and say, look, you really need to remember this. And the way that this story is put together is evidence of that. Let me make sure I've actually got my microphone on for the sake of the recording. Okay, good. So the way that this story is put together is evidence of that. So I just put this together as a sample. The whole story from chapters 3 through 5 follows an arc that centers on the actual crossing. Now, how long does it take to say that somebody crossed a river? Well, we just did, right? It doesn't take any time at all. But the story as it's recorded takes this entire amount of space to tell us essentially about the crossing. The crossing itself begins, even earlier. We're going to see the priests go into the river pretty early on. And at that point, it's almost like time stops. Right? And we're told this huge number of things that are going on during the river crossing. All of these things that are going on basically simultaneously. And so we get a lot of text about this, but it centers on the crossing. Centered around that, we have the priests going down into the river, and then the priests coming up out of the river stopping, then the river resuming, the memorial stones being taken out of the river, then the memorial stones being set up after the crossing. Around that, we've got these texts that talk about how God is going to drive the Canaanites out of the land, along with the 6 other nations that inhabit the land. God is going to drive them out, and this miraculous crossing at the river is going to be proof of that. Right? So Israel is going to know that God will be with them, and that he will give them the land, and he's going to drive out all of these other people. They're going to know that because God is going to visibly be with them in the crossing of the river. All right, mirrored against that, on the other side, after the crossing, we're told that the Canaanites hear about the river crossing and that their hearts melt. All right, so this proof of conquest, this proof that God is with Israel, becomes apparent not just to Israel, but also to the Canaanites. All right, and then finally, all of that is mirrored with some ceremonial aspects of the story. And in fact, this is, I think, a big reason why the story is so elaborately put together, that there is this ceremonial aspect to the entire thing. Right? It's like Israel at Mount Sinai. But that entire episode was very, very ceremonial. It starts with Israel being consecrated for crossing the river and entering into the promised land. It ends with the men of the wilderness generation being circumcised and the nation of Israel holding Passover for the first time in the promised land. All right, so all of this is built around the central miracle of God stopping the river and Israel crossing over on dry ground. And within this, we're going to see lots and lots of repetition. We're going to see little details come out at one point and then be repeated a few verses later to add another point, and then be repeated again a few verses later to add yet another point. So we're going to watch this story kind of unfold slowly. And even within this, because I don't want to belabor this point too much, within this there are little structures to each of these specific texts. So like there's within certain points of this, the way that one of these points would be told is also itself a mirror reading, or what we call a chiasm. Where you have a central point and then you have mirrored points built around it. So the whole thing is very, very ornately put together. So let us go ahead and jump into the text with this in mind, that our attention is supposed to be drawn especially to the things being recorded here. Joshua chapter 3, verse 1. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim. And they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, as soon as you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. Then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And Joshua said to the priests, take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on before the people. So they took up the Ark of the Covenant and went before the people. All right, so this is, I think we've said this before, a lot of what happens in Joshua is explicitly supposed to remind us of the Exodus. In fact, later on in the crossing story, the text itself is going to compare this to the Red Sea crossing. Excuse me, but there are other elements that are supposed to bring the Exodus to mind. So not only do you have the miraculous crossing, but you also have the Ark of the Covenant going before the people, leading them. We saw that in the Exodus. We have the consecration that happens. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But we also have the matter of the spies. We've talked about this a little bit, how the fact that Joshua has sent out these 2 spies is supposed to call to mind, Israel sending out the 12 spies earlier. That was a big story of Israel's failure to obey, their failure to have faith. They send out the 12 spies, they come back, 10 of them bring a bad report. It's only Caleb and Joshua that bring back a good report. And how does Israel react to that? They spend all this time deliberating and ultimately decide, no, we're not going to go in. And so God curses them, and then what do they decide? Oh, we'll go in, we'll go in. And what happens to them? Yeah, they get destroyed. And so, because at that point, they are trying to do an end run around this curse that God has put on them, that they're all going to die in the wilderness. So it's a major, major story of Israel's faithlessness and disobedience. So at this point in the story, the fact that you've had these spies sent out, and they have returned, there has been this question hanging, how is Israel going to react? All right, so at the end of chapter 2, we at least saw how the spies acted. Those 2 spies acted more faithfully and honorably than the previous spies did, at least the previous 10. So the 2 men returned. They said to Joshua, truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. So they bring back a good report. Right, the Lord's going to give us the land. The hearts of the people melt away before us. And so the question at this point, the question that's implied after the spies report is, how will Israel react? Will they be obedient, or will they be like their fathers who were disobedient? Are they, we're supposed to remember what the Egyptian generation did. What will this generation do? Well, you look at the very first thing that we read after the report of the spies. It's the very first sentence in Joshua chapter 3, verse 1. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim. We've seen this phrase before a few times in the law of Moses. So-and-so rose early in the morning. Can y'all remember any occasions where we see people rising early in the morning and what they're going to do? Yeah, I mean, there's a few occurrences. I mean, this phrase is not super common, at least in the law. Consider Abraham. We were once told that Abraham rose early in the morning. What was he going to do? Why did he rise early in the morning? Yes, to go sacrifice Isaac. Right? It was an indication of Abraham's obedience. Right? He doesn't just get up and do it, he gets up early to do it. And we find the phrase used this way pretty commonly through the Hebrew Scriptures. Right? And whenever we see it used, that's generally what it signifies. When so-and-so rises early, it's almost always a sign that they are doing so to obey. God's told them to do something, and they're going to do it. So that's the very first reaction that we read to the spies' report. Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out. All right, so they're actually going to do this. And Joshua, actually the interesting thing about this is that we're not told about Joshua's orders first. First, we're told that at the end of those 3 days, the officers went through the camp. All right, now we assume they're acting under authority. But we've seen Joshua's obedience already in this chapter, and now we're starting to see the obedience of the rest of the people. Now you've got these officers, these chief men among the people. Right, and we've seen how Israel's chief men have acted in the past. Think of Korah and Dathan and Abiram and some of the other chief men of the people who rise up against Moses. It's not just the commoners in Israel who have been faithless and disobedient in the past generation. It's also the leaders who have been unfaithful in the past generation. Here, the officers go through the camp and command the people, as soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Right, so they're encouraging the people to obey rather than to disobey. They're also encouraging them to have reverence for the ark. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. All right, so they're supposed to let the Lord do the leading, and they're supposed to do so from a respectful distance. All right, and this is stuff that we've seen emphasized in the law before, that there is supposed to be distance between Israel and the ark. Wayne? That 2,000 cubits? Yeah, that sounds about right. So yeah, remember you've got the priests carrying it. So the ark has a retinue with it. So even though there's quite a bit of distance here, it should be followable.
But I assume that cloud of fire, so in front of it too.
Possibly. I mean, we're not told in the
Not
text.
told, but
Yeah.
I'm just saying, in order to protect, because it's a mile and a half, that's almost out of sight.
Yeah, depending on the terrain.
Yeah, that's almost out, so you go a mile and a half away from here, you see the church building, oh my God.
Yeah, I mean,
You gotta think about it like that, because
Mhm.
that's kind of the way it is, mile and a half away is a long way.
yes.
And to be that far behind something and try to keep up with it,
Mm-hmm.
it's gotta be something around.
Right. So there is some way in which they know where the ark is going, right? Because it is meant to be, it is meant to lead them, to show them the way.
Well, I'm just
Yeah.
saying that because if the cloud and the.
Right, then it's obvious how it's working.
If they know where it is.
Yeah.
But we're not telling them, so there's gotta be something.
Yeah, something's going on. So, all right. So it's going to guide them in the way that they're going to go. And then we get Joshua speaking to the people. All right, so the officers speak first, and then we have Joshua speaking to the people directly. As far as I'm aware, I think this might be the first time that Joshua has done this directly. I think throughout the story up to this point, Joshua has just spoken through the officers. But he speaks to the people. Actually, speaks to the he speaks to the people. Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow morning the Lord will do wonders among you. All right, so this is supposed to call to mind Israel at Mount Sinai. All right, so this is another one of those details that we're supposed to compare between this generation and the Egypt generation. They're told to consecrate themselves. Does anybody remember when the previous generation was told to consecrate themselves? Passover was one point where they were supposed to consecrate themselves. There was one other special event that they were supposed to consecrate themselves for. Yes, at Mount Sinai, Moses told them to consecrate themselves. And in that instance, here where it's not specified what the consecration entails. But if it's like the previous consecration at Mount Sinai that we read about in Exodus 19, verses 10 through 15, that included a ceremonial washing of clothes. It included abstaining from sexual activity. And in that way, they were to make themselves clean, to set themselves apart for coming before the Lord at Mount Sinai. Wayne?
Just another question.
Uh-huh.
It's not told here again.
Yeah.
And so all these details are left out.
Right.
So you're kind of left assuming things.
Mm-hmm.
I would think, I'm just assuming, I don't know. I would think that the consecration would be a special ceremonial ritual.
Yeah. That's typically what we see.
I mean, you would
Yeah.
think that.
Yeah, that's typically what we see in the Hebrew Scriptures, a ceremonial washing,
Yeah.
at the very least. Now, that does bring something up about the story. We're going to see this as we read through. When we're at a particular point in the story and we think, well, there's all of these details that are not present, and how much are we supposed to read into it, and how much are we supposed to compare to what we've seen previously in the story, we're going to see something very similar going on with what the Lord says to Joshua and then what Joshua relates to the people. We're going to see a very similar process going on where the Lord is going to tell Joshua something that doesn't include any kind of detail at all. And then whenever the text tells us about Joshua relating it to the people, it includes all the detail. And so at least Joshua himself, as he's presented in the story, is engaged in this process of filling in the details. Right? So as we're reading the story, I think we are invited to do that same thing. If we see something and think, oh, that's interesting, I wonder what the details are on that. I mean, that's a question that the text invites us to ask.
I think kind of add like us to
Yeah. So you let the law help us interpret what we're reading here, right? Because everything is meant to be compared and contrasted. All right, so what happens when Israel is at Mount Sinai? Well, I mean, they do consecrate themselves. Ultimately, though, what's their reaction at Mount Sinai? But go ahead. Yes, that's the major thing that they did at Mount Sinai. They, at least starting out, at the very least, they keep their respectful distance from the mountain. Or they're told not to touch it. If anything touches it, that has to die. So they keep back from the mountain. They are respectful, but they're fearful. Right? The Lord speaks to them from the mountain, delivering the 10 Commandments to them. They hear the voice of the Lord. And they say, no, please stop talking. We cannot bear to hear you. And it's at that point that Moses goes up to the mountain to receive the rest of the Torah and bring it down to them. So Israel is fearful and ultimately faithless, disobedient. Because while they're waiting on Moses, who's up on the mountain, they make the golden calf and adulterate themselves, basically, with this golden calf. So the question here, what's Israel going to do? What's this generation going to do? They're going to consecrate themselves, and they're going to do so because they expect the presence of the Lord, just like the presence of the Lord was at Mount Sinai. Are they going to be fearful like Israel was, or are they going to be strong and courageous, to use the phrase that we've seen in Joshua already? Are they going to be obedient to the Lord, or are they going to be faithless to the Lord? So we've mentioned God's presence. Let's go ahead and talk about that. The consecration, at least in Exodus, was done because of God's presence. Right? They are to cleanse themselves, set themselves apart, because they are about to stand in the presence of the Lord at Mount Sinai. We find that likewise emphasized here at the Jordan crossing. That God is going to be among them. In fact, that's what Joshua tells them. Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow morning the Lord will do wonders among you. God is going to be present in Israel in a very visible way. And so they are, in a special way. Right? The Lord's always present in the sense that the ark is present. Right? But this is going to be a conspicuous presence. Something special is going to happen. And so Israel is to consecrate themselves. The Lord is going to do wonders among you. This is yet another tie back to the Exodus. Because the Egypt generation is likewise told that the Lord is going to do wonders. In that case, the wonders were the plagues of Egypt. Here, the wonders, we'll see how this unfolds, but I'll go ahead and give you the spoiler, right? The wonders are going to be judgment against Canaan. So we get this, this parallel set up between this generation of Israel and the previous generation of Israel, but we get another parallel set up between the Canaanites and the Egyptians. And we've seen that a little bit already, like last week when we were talking about, well, why does nobody in Canaan try to make peace with Israel? Right? And we said they weren't prevented from doing that because we see Rahab do it. We're going to see the Gibeonites do it. What prevents them from making peace with Israel is the hardness of their own hearts, which makes them like Pharaoh. All right. So as this is all unfolding, we're getting all of these things piled in to invite us to compare and contrast this generation with the Egypt generation. And that's going to become explicit, meaning that it's something that the text is going to talk about out loud later on. Any questions or comments there on those first 6 verses before we continue on to the next passage? All right, verse 7. The Lord said to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And as for you, command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, when you come to the brink of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan." And Joshua said to the people of Israel, "Come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God." And Joshua said, "Here is how you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is passing over before you into the Jordan. Now therefore take 12 men from the tribes of Israel, from each tribe a man. And when the soles of the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off from flowing, and the waters coming down from above shall stand in one heap." All right, so God offers promises in this passage. Some related to Joshua, some related to Israel in total. He begins by promising to exalt Joshua. "Today I'll begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they will know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you." All right, we're going to have more to say about that later on. We're going to let that lie for now. I think we'll come back to this probably next week. But this has some pretty massive messianic significance. We're supposed to read this with Jesus in mind. So we'll come back to that. In this context, it emphasizes Joshua's place as Moses' successor. And we've been saying there's this question in the book, is Joshua going to fill Moses' shoes? And here, the Lord begins to promise Joshua that he indeed will. All right, "I'll begin to exalt you so that they'll know that as I was with Moses, so I am with you." Joshua then turns around and conveys God's promises to Israel. Now, this is what we were talking about just a minute ago, when we said that the Lord will tell Joshua something, and then whenever Joshua conveys that to Israel, we see Joshua filling in a lot of details. Look at the way that the Lord speaks to Joshua in verse 8. "As for you, command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, when you come to the brink of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan." All right, so God's instructions to Joshua: speak to the priests and tell them, when you come to the brink of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. All right, so pretty simple. Talk to the priests, tell them to stand in the river. Okay, now what does Joshua do? Joshua said to the people of Israel, all right, now this is interesting, because he's not, as it's related to us, he's not going to the priests, he's going to Israel, just to the people. And he says, "Come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God." And Joshua said, "Here is how you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites." All right, so that's already one pretty big detail that Joshua is relating to the people that we didn't see recorded earlier in the Lord speaking to Joshua. This is proof that God is going to drive out these 7 nations. Then, "Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is passing over before you into the Jordan. Now therefore take 12 men from the tribes of Israel, from each tribe a man." All right, there's another detail. What's up with these 12 men? Or we're going to talk about more of that in just a second. God has not yet said anything to Joshua about taking 12 men. At least not recorded. Right? I think that's the important thing. "When the soles of the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off from flowing, and the waters coming down from above shall stand in one heap." All right, so there's another detail that, again, Joshua is conveying to Israel, that we don't see the Lord initially conveying to Joshua. So now what's going on here is not that Joshua is just ignoring what the Lord told him to do and just going off and doing his own thing. Right? There's no evidence in the text at all that that's how we're supposed to interpret what Joshua is doing. Excuse me. Instead, I think how we're supposed to understand this is that we are yet again seeing Joshua filling in that prophetic role that we have talked about. How Joshua stands at the head of the prophets. Right? The book of Joshua is the first book of the prophets. What we see happening, and this is something that we see happening fairly commonly in the prophets, is that the Lord gives a command, and then Joshua turns around and conveys its meaning. So he doesn't just repeat what the Lord said, but also explains what it means and explains the details of it. All right, and ultimately, everything that Joshua says in this passage comes to pass. Right, so he's not speaking contrary to the Lord or anything. But what the text is emphasizing to us is Joshua's place, like Moses was before him, like the prophets will be after him, that Joshua's place as the Lord's spokesman, right? Basically the Lord's interpreter, right? He stands before the people and reports what the Lord has commanded and explains what it means and fills in the details. So, these are the promises. God's going to be among Israel. God is going to drive out the inhabitants before them. And as proof that God is among Israel, and as proof that God is going to drive out these 7 nations, the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Lord's presence, is going to go down into the river and cause it to stop. And it is going to stand in one heap. All right, so the last thing that we'd have to deal with out of this text is this little bit about the 12 men in verse 12. Right, and it's perhaps providential that it's played out that way, that it's in verse 12 that we hear about the 12. Remember, the verse numbers aren't original. Take 12 men from the tribes of Israel, from each tribe a man. Now, in what we've read up to this point, do we have any idea what these 12 men are for? Joshua says, take 12 men. Okay, what for? What's their purpose? In this text so far, we're not told anything else about these 12 men. Not yet. This is maybe one of the biggest examples of what we were talking about earlier, the way that the book chooses to tell the story. That we have things unfolding in a kind of a slow, what at least in English we would consider it to be a slow and repetitive way. I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean that as a commentary on how we tend to interpret things. From a Hebrew perspective, this just draws attention to things and helps keep us in the story. We know that we've got these 12 men out there for some reason. Later on in the text, we're going to be told again about these 12 men being set apart, and then we're going to be told a little bit more about them. And then we're going to hear about them like a third time and a fourth time, and each time we're going to hear a little bit more detail about what it is that they are doing. All right, but I just want to take note of that. That's the way that that the story is choosing to present these events unfolding. So that brings us to the next section of the text. And actually, I wrote that down wrong. 10 does not come after 14 in most counties that I'm aware of. The biggest section of the text, the biggest chunk, is going to be this matter of the priests entering into the river stopping, and then the stones being taken up. That's going to start next in verse 14, and it's going to stretch well into chapter 4. And that's a long enough text that I think we had better leave that for next week because we have already hit our time. But we do have time for any final questions or comments about what's going on in the story or the way the story is being told, the significance of different things. Any questions or comments to finish us out? Wayne?
Okay, I think something out of the law, I read all this before.
Yeah.
But here's another little detail. Okay, it says back here in verse 4.
Uh-huh.
That you shall maintain by 2,000 cubits in each distance, okay?
Yeah.
So, when the ark comes to rest in the middle of the river,
Mm-hmm.
you have to still maintain that distance.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the reason why I kept figuring, now why, it says way back up in some city or town, way back down.
Yes. Actually, I want us to hold on to that thought because that's going to be in the next text. Yeah,
right.
in the very next passage.
How that was going to play out.
Yes, that's an important factor because that's it's gonna connect what we've already read to what we're about to read. In the next passage, we are going to get a sense of the scope of this stoppage of the river, right? And if you're thinking about the river parts maybe as wide as this church building or something, you're thinking way too little, right? This is an immense stoppage of water that stretches out a way long way. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it, that, this 2,000 cubits distance is maintained even as they're passing across, meaning that Israel is passing either 2,000 cubits south or 2,000 cubits north of where the ark is standing. Personally, I'd want to pass south, since the river's coming from the north. So, all right, good observation. And that will launch us into next week when we start in verse 14. All right, thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions and comments. So let's head on out and let all the cooties air out. Talking about